Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, Tony here. Welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. God bless you. And I pray that as you tune in today, that you are dwelling in the shadow of God, that you feel His presence around you, that your heart is filled with His peace. And I pray for the wisdom of God in your heart and life. I pray for the light of God over you, the guidance of God, and angels of God around you, the protection of God. And God bless you, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. And I do pray that it will be a blessing and an encouragement to you. You may or may not know that I lead a men's purity group every Thursday night here in the St. Louis area, and on any given night there's normally 8 to 16 guys in attendance, and all of these guys are Christian men. They love God, they want their life to count for God's kingdom, they want to serve God, but each man in the group comes to the group because we have each struggled with our sexual gift in different ways. And we have men that have struggled with internet pornography. That's a very common theme. We have men that have had affairs. We have men that have struggled with same-sex attraction. We have men that have acted out with prostitutes and with sex massage and with sexting and all kinds of different things that men struggle with. So the purpose of the group is that we're seeking to be healthier men. We're seeking to learn to manage our sexual gift in a healthier way. We're seeking to bring our sexual gift under the authority of Christ. We're seeking to learn to honor both God and our wife with the expression of our sexual gift. And most recently in this group, I've been sharing with the men 2 different documents that I put together. One is a list of 12 questions that a man can ask his wife. And in the metaphor of an iceberg, you know how there's the surface of the water, and you can see 5% of the iceberg sticking up above the water. But this means that there's this big giant thing lurking underneath the water. 95% of the iceberg you can't even see because it's underneath the water. And in this metaphor, you guys, what I'm suggesting is that more often than not, we kind of get into the routine of life and we kind of get in this cycle. And if we're not careful, we're living life primarily from the surface up. In other words, in the context of our relationship, it's kind of platonic in nature and there's not much depth. And we talk in our relationship about what's necessary to talk about to get by. What time are you leaving for work tomorrow? Are you going to make the kids lunch? What time will you pick up Johnny from the baseball game? And I got to drop off the laundry at the laundromat, and I've got to stop by the grocery store. And so it's the details and the helter-skelter and busyness of life that kind of consumes our time, energy, and effort. And if we're not careful, we never get below the surface to kind of try to connect on a deeper level, a more heart-to-heart level. And so this list of 12 questions that I put together was actually designed to help a man move toward his wife in the hope, with the intent and the purpose of connecting with his wife, moving toward his wife, pursuing his wife, and trying to connect with her on a deeper level, below the surface, on a more heart-to-heart level. And along with that, the second document that we've been talking about at the Thursday night group is a document that I put together for my wife that I call Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. And I'll say that again. It's titled Tony's Listening and Validation Pledge to Sherry. And this is a document that I wrote for real to my wife some months ago. And the pledge consists of 23 different aspects or 23 promises that I made to her. And I'll just share with you guys that the way that this pledge came about is that my wife and I are actually in counseling together right now. We've been married for 37 years. And if you've heard our story, you know that we went to hell and back in the context of our marriage. And throughout our marriage, we've been in and out of counseling numerous times. And the fact is, I am a licensed professional counselor, and I think it's very, very good for counselors to go to counseling. I think it's good for therapists to go to therapy. And kind of some issues come to the surface that we're struggling with. So we're trying to work through some things and understand some things and communicate about some issues and struggles and be in a healthier place with one another. So we've been doing this work together, and it's been a very good experience. And it was in the context of this therapeutic work that one of my wife's complaints about me is that she says that I don't listen to her. She would like me to listen better. And with that being said, I freely admit that I need to work on my listening skills. I'm sure that I can listen much better than I do. And then the issue of validation emerges. My wife felt that I need to validate her better, and I have no doubt that this is absolutely true. And therefore, I began to struggle with, I asked the question, well, what is validation? Why is this important? So I began to do a little bit of research and study on the topic of validation. And let me say just a few words about this. I learned that validation doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with the other person's subjective reality. In other words, my wife might think or feel this, ABC, XYZ. She has an opinion, a feeling, a viewpoint, the way that she sees something and experiences something. It's her subjective reality. So validation doesn't mean that I have to agree with her, but what it means is that I'm seeking to understand her experience, her feelings, her thoughts, her viewpoint, and that validation means that I'm allowing another person's emotional state a space to exist. Validation says, I hear you, I see you, I get it, and I care about your feelings. And in the same way that a coin has two sides, heads and tails, I learned that invalidation, therefore, is the process of denying, rejecting, or dismissing the other person's feelings. Invalidation sends the message that a person's subjective emotional experience is inaccurate, insignificant, or unacceptable. So I'm seeing and learning and understanding and being reminded of the fact that validation is incredibly important. And let me just say, guys, that this whole validation thing is easier said than done, because if you feel different than the other person, you see it different, you think different, you feel different, you have a different opinion, then it's very hard to validate that person when you feel like you're not sure that you can agree with where they're coming from. So I'm learning that it's very important to validate the other person even if you disagree with them. And just for the fun of it, I didn't really intend to teach or really talk that much specifically about what validation is. And just for the fun of it, I'll go ahead and throw this in for you guys, something that I developed here that I'm calling the 6 steps of validation. One is to stay present. This is a very good way to validate the other person. Be present to them. In other words, if they're trying to communicate to you what they think, what they feel, what's going on for them, what is their subjective experience, and maybe there's even escalation and disagreement and tension, and it's difficult to communicate about a particular issue. And what we do sometimes is we withdraw, we disconnect, we say, I can't talk about this, I don't want to talk, and we disconnect from the other person. So one important step of validation is to stay present. Stay with the other person, stay in the conversation, continue to communicate, continue to try to understand. The second step of validation is to have the heart and the posture and the humility within yourself that says, I want to understand. And then to even convey that to the other person. I want to understand. I can't promise you that I will agree with what you're saying or the way that you see the issue. I can't promise you that I'll agree with you, but what I can promise is that I want to understand, and I'll try really hard to understand what you're saying and what you're thinking and what you're feeling, even if I happen to disagree with it. The third step of validation is to sincerely listen. To try to go above and beyond the call of duty, to listen to the other person and understand where they're coming from. The fourth step of validation is to try to be as objective as possible and to resist subjectivity. And let me just say, by the way, that I think that this is way easier said than done, because the fact is that we all live in our own body. I live in my skin, and therefore I see the world through my eyes. I hear the world through my ears. I have my own thoughts and feelings, and therefore my own experience in the world and in the relationship is very subjective, right? It's what I think, what I feel, what I see, what I prefer, what I need, the way I think it should be. So it's very subjective. It's not always objective. So, for example, mathematics is objective, right? 2 plus 2 is 4. That's very objective. There's no subjectivity about it. Regardless of your emotional state, your subjective state, it doesn't change the reality, the black and white reality that 2 plus 2 is 4. That's very objective. Well, it's hard for people to be objective in the context of a relationship all the time, because your own thoughts and feelings and preferences and viewpoints and opinions get in the way. So it's not always objective. It's very subjective. Every one of us is very subjective. And let me just say, by the way, that I think this is a great value of the therapeutic process. When people go to counseling, let's say that there's a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and when they are at home, they trigger one another and they do kind of this relational dance and this relational cycle. So if Mr. Smith says something, he kind of knows how to push the buttons on Mrs. Smith, and so she reacts and she gets emotional, and then she says this, and then he says that, and he reacts to her, and she escalates and he escalates above her, and they do this relational dance and cycle that they're very accustomed to because they are subjectively involved in the situation. So when you go to a counselor, you meet with a therapist, a great value of the room, the great value of having the third person there is that this third person, the therapist, is more objective than either Mr. or Mrs. Smith. Mr. and Mrs. Smith are both very subjective because it's their relationship, it's their family, it's their money, it's their sex, it's their vacation, it's their church, it's their relationship. They're involved. So it's subjective for them, but for the therapist, it's not my sex, it's not my relationship, it's not my kids, it's not my money. So I can be way more objective. So therefore, if Mr. and Mrs. Smith were at home and they were trying to talk about this difficult issue, and Mr. Smith says XYZ, and Mrs. Smith reacts against that, and they begin to escalate, but in the therapeutic room, they can't do that, because when Mr. Smith makes a particular point, which would trigger Mrs. Smith, and she does get triggered, but the therapist says, now wait a minute, Mrs. Smith, he's making a point here. Now let's slow down and let's process this together. So the therapeutic process kind of forces people to slow down and to begin to look at things, to take a deep breath, to step back, and to process things a little bit more objectively and less subjectively, and therefore sometimes that can be very helpful. So the fourth step of validation is to try to be as objective as possible and to resist subjectivity. The fifth step of validation is to mirror or parrot what you hear your partner saying. So when you listen to them, you say back to them, what I hear you saying is this, ABC, XYZ, 1, 2, 3. So when you parrot back to them what you're hearing, it's like a check and a balance. It lets them know that you've heard them and that you're accurately understanding what they're saying. And you might be surprised when you go to parrot back and you say to your wife, well, what I hear you saying is this, this, and this, and this. She says, no, that's not what I was saying. So people think that they're hearing the other person, but sometimes what they are saying is not what you're hearing. And by the way, that reminds me, I have a little plaque hanging in the lobby at my office, and it says something like, which is more important, what you said or what they heard? Because the fact is that there can be a vast difference between the two. And what a person says is not always what the other person hears. And by the way, you guys, I can't tell you how many times this has happened in my own personal life and relationships. It's happened to me many times, but I see it over and over again in the counseling room because I think it's just part of the human condition. So I have a couple there, and Mrs. Jones says, and then we were at my cousin's barbecue, and then my cousin said this, and I said this, and my husband said this. And he looks at her like she's absolutely crazy, and he says, I did not say that. And she says, yes, you did. I was there. I heard you say it. And he says, I did not say that. And it's amazing because everybody is sincere. And she really thinks that he said that, and he really thinks that he did not say that. So it's amazing how people can be in the same room, at the same place, looking at each other, the same conversation, and they each got two ears, and they each have a mouth, but the way they experience that moment, that event, and who said this, and who said what, and what you said, and what I heard, how totally, radically different two people can experience the same event or the same conversation. So this is a step that can be helpful to mirror or to parrot back to your partner what you are hearing them say. And the sixth step of validation is to try to be as empathetic as possible. And if you can't be empathetic, then at least be sympathetic. And let me tell you what I think the distinction is, because I find that it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly what is the difference between empathy and sympathy. So I looked up the word empathy, and it means the ability to understand and to share the feelings of another. That means that I share your feelings. I relate to your feelings, almost like I can feel what you feel. That's empathy. The Bible says, weep with those that weep, right? So if your heart and life is full of pain and you're crying, that I can feel your pain and I can weep with you because I can feel your pain. That's what empathy is. And I think it's incredibly difficult to get to a place of empathy. It's not always an easy place to get to. So the way that I see the distinction here in this moment, I'm seeing the difference between your head and your heart. Empathy is when you can relate to the other person from your heart. You feel in your heart what they feel. It's a heart-to-heart thing. Sympathy is from your head. When you can look at a person, you see their situation, you see what they're going through, and so you have sympathy. You see, like, holy cow, this lady's spouse died. This lady at church, her husband died, and now she has to raise these kids all by herself, and there's going to be financial implications, and I can see how overwhelming this is. And I don't necessarily feel in my heart what she feels, but in my head, I can see and understand how difficult this is. So sympathy, I think, is like a mechanism of your head, your intellect, and empathy is more a mechanism of your heart. It's feeling what they feel. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just kind of talking out loud right now, trying to reconcile the meaning of these words to my own self. So a step of validation is to try to be empathetic. That's the ideal thing. If you can feel what your spouse is feeling, that's beautiful, because then you could really relate to them and understand where they're at, what they see, what they think, what they feel, because you can feel what they feel. But if you can't get there, if you can't feel what they feel, then at least you can be sympathetic, and in your head, you're going above and beyond the call of duty to try to understand what they see and think and feel, even if you yourself cannot feel that. And with all that being said, you guys, I want to throw in a thought here. Why am I even talking about this? Because this is the Power of Purity podcast, right? And so, Tony, what does this have to do with sex? So let me talk about that for a moment. And the point that I want to make here, you guys, is the reality that sex happens in the context of a relationship, right? If we're going to do sex God's way, according to God's will, plan, design, and purpose for sex, God intends for us to express and experience our sexual gift within the context of a marriage relationship that is a loving, committed, and monogamous relationship. So sex always happens in the context of a relationship. And this is incredibly important for us to remember. You cannot separate the two. And I think this is where a lot of guys get in trouble sometimes, because they forget this reality. Here's a way to say what I'm trying to say. Imagine if the relationship itself in your marriage is really bad. There's bad communication. You don't talk. Maybe trust is broken. You don't relate to each other. You're not friends. There's not intimacy. You don't spend time together. The relationship isn't very healthy. Well, if that's the condition of your relationship, then what do you think the chances are that you're going to have a healthy, successful, vibrant, connected, fulfilling, satisfying, prosperous, sensual, sexual relationship with your wife? In other words, if the relationship isn't good, dude, then chances are the sex isn't going to be good. And what that means is if you want a good sex life and you want a healthy sexual relationship with your wife, then, dude, you need to cultivate the relationship that you have. You need to try to have a healthier relationship. And I like the metaphor here of the greenhouse metaphor. I live in the St. Louis area, and so many people love to grow these beautiful, delicious tomatoes in the summertime. June, July, August, it's conducive to the growth of tomatoes. And you can't grow tomatoes in St. Louis in the middle of the wintertime, December, January, February, because it's bitter cold and there's ice and there's snow in the wintertime here in St. Louis. And it's not unusual for the temperature to get down in the teens or even the single digits or even below zero sometimes with the wind chill factor. So you could never grow tomatoes in the middle of wintertime in St. Louis unless you put up a greenhouse in your backyard. And if you put up a greenhouse, guess what? You could grow tomatoes even in January and February in St. Louis because you trick the system, you trick the tomato plants, because when you have a greenhouse, you're able to regulate the environment on the inside of the greenhouse, and you're able to create an environment that is conducive to the growth of tomato plants. You can regulate the temperature and the humidity level and the light, and you can create this perfect environment so when you plant those little tomato plants, the tomato plants think it's the middle of July, even though it's really January and February in St. Louis. So you can grow the tomatoes if you have the greenhouse. And in this metaphor, you guys, what I'm trying to say is that we create a relational environment in the context of our home, in the context of our marriage. And that in this metaphor, the sexual relationship is like the tomato plant. You want the sexual relationship to grow and to prosper and to be healthy and satisfying and strong and fulfilling. Well, what kind of environment is necessary for a sexual relationship to grow and be healthy? So, guys, sometimes we need to work on the relational aspect of our marriage, our relationship with our wife. Dude, if I was to ask you, how is your relationship with your wife? Is it healthy? Are you close to your wife? Are you pursuing your wife? Is there a sense of connection and intimacy and trust? And do you spend time with her? Do you date her? Are you pursuing her? Are you friends with your wife? And as you cultivate these qualities, these relational qualities and dynamics, and you create this relational environment that's conducive to the growth of healthy sexuality, then chances are you're going to experience a more satisfying and healthy and fulfilling sexual relationship in your heart, in your life, in your relationship with your wife. And you're bringing your sexual gift into submission to God, and you're trying to do this thing God's way, and you're learning to honor God and your wife and cultivate this relationship with your wife that's very beautiful and awesome and fulfilling, that will allow sexuality to bloom and to prosper and to be beautiful and to be satisfying and sensual and wonderful the way that you want it to be. So my point is, you guys, that we need to work on the relationship with our wife. And what I'm saying and suggesting here, this pledge that I wrote to my wife, Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry, this is what I'm pursuing here. I'm understanding that I want my relationship with my wife to be healthy, to be strong, to be prosperous, to be fulfilling and satisfying for both of us. And for that to happen, then I need to evaluate and consider, Tony, what do you need to work on, dude? Are you pursuing Sherry? And if my wife feels like I'm not hearing her, I don't listen to her well, I'm not validating her thoughts and her feelings and her viewpoint and her emotions, then I need to work on my listening skills. I need to work on my validation skills, because this is going to nurture a healthier relationship and connection between my wife and I. It's going to make our relationship stronger, which creates the possibility that our sexual selves, our sexual life together, can be healthier and stronger and more fulfilling. So the two always go together, relationship and sex. You cannot separate the two. And this is how we got on this theme in my men's group. And the fact is, in the same way a coin has two sides, heads and tails, I would advocate that there will always be two sides of this whole issue around sex. We talk about the sex side, the sex itself. That's one side of the coin. But the other side is the relationship part. And you can't disconnect the two. So in the context of my Thursday night group, we talk about sexual purity. We talk about sex quite a bit. But we also talk about relationship and our relationship with our wife. And what does it mean to pursue our wife and to be more connected to our wife and to be healthier in the relationship? Because, dude, if you don't have the relationship part, then you're probably not going to have the sex part. And the two go together. And that's why when my wife and I were in therapy most recently, and I was understanding that my wife was feeling that I'm not listening well and I'm not validating, well, I want to understand what is that and how do I work on that and how do I strengthen that. So I wrote to my wife Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. And it consists of 23 vignettes, and I am out of time for this week. So if you come back next week, I'm going to share with you Tony's listening and validation pledge to Sherry. Our goal, guys, is to strengthen our relationship with our wife, to make our relationship with our wife healthier than it's ever been, and therefore it will nurture and provide the perfect environment that's conducive to healthy sexual intimacy. So with that being said, I'll look forward to seeing you right back here next week. In the meantime, be blessed, have an awesome day, have an awesome week, and be strong with God. And I'll look forward to seeing you right back here next week. God bless you guys. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.